So welcome to my class, and in this we are continuing on with indifference curve. In this I'm going to talk about the slope of the indifference curve and the marginal rate of substitution. Alright, so what is marginal rate of substitution? In the last class we just told you how much it tells you about the ratio of the change of, say, loss, the sacrifice of a good upon or rather to a gain of a commodity, of another good. So that's what it is. So it just tells you about the rate at which the consumer is willing to sacrifice one good to obtain one more unit of the other good. So that's what it is. So we just have to look at this to understand it once again. So marginal rate of substitution is what? Again, it is a rate at which the consumer is willing to sacrifice one good to obtain one more unit of the other good. Because, see, we took up the assumption that he consumes only two commodities, two goods. And with his given income, he has to keep making those adjustments. And what is interesting is that each bundle that he takes gives him the same amount of satisfaction, and that is why it's known as an indifference sect, or when we plot it, it is called the indifference curve. So now look at this. In this, I've shown you. Look at this now. Let us see the fourth column. So let the two goods be X and Y. Suppose that the consumer is in position to make different combinations of two goods, that each combination gives the consumer the same amount of satisfaction or utility. So in this numerical example, these are the combinations A, B, C and D. So we have these combinations A, B, C and D. Alright. So in this, so what do you see in A combination? The A combination shows, okay, and what is the assumption? The assumption is that each combination gives the consumer same utility. So for this to happen, two things are necessary. That one is, if the quantity of one good consumed is increased, the quantity of the other good consumed must be decreased. And second, as the quantity of one good goes on increasing, the quantity of the other good not only decreases, but decreases at a decreasing rate. So that is very interesting to note. So what do we find? That when consumer moves from the combination A to B, the good X increases by 1 unit while Y decreases by 4 units. Why so? It is so because if X is increased while Y is not decreased, the consumer will have more quantity of goods, and more goods means more utility, which is against the basic consumption of indifference schedule, that each combination has the same utility. Similarly, if Y is decreased and simultaneously X is not increased, the utility level will fall. Now second is, as the quantity of one good goes on increasing, the quantity of the other good not only decreases, but decreases at a diminishing rate. Now what we have to note is that as the consumer moves from combination A to B, he is willing to give up 4Y to obtain 1X. In other words, 4 units of the price of 4 units of Y is the price of the consumer is willing to pay to obtain 1 unit of X. When I say price, in terms of the goods. Okay. So, okay, let's just come back to this. Because we are going to talk about in the slope. So how do we calculate marginal rate of substitution? It is change in the quantity of the good the consumer is willing to sacrifice divided by change in the quantity of the good the consumer is willing to obtain. So in our examples, Y good is being sacrificed to obtain X. So how will you write MRS? MRS will be change in Y divided by change in X. That is, when the consumer moves from combination A to B, he is willing to give up 4Y to obtain 1 unit of X. Okay, so let me just show you with the help of a diagram. Look here. This is the diagram that I've drawn. Okay, so look here. So when the consumer moves from combination A to B, suppose from A to B, he is willing to give up 4Y to obtain 1 unit of X. Therefore, MRS is equal to change in Y upon change in X. So change in Y is 4. That is, from 8 he goes to 4. So 8 minus, so that is it. So 4 and change in X is 1. So 4 is the absolute value. Note that in mathematical terms, the value of MRS should be minus 4 and not 4. It is because the numerator by definition has a negative value. But in the analysis, we always take the absolute value. This makes the comparison meaningful in economics or in this whatever we are doing. For example, when the consumer moves from B to C, okay. So here you just see how this has gone up. What is this? So from 8 to 4, he's given up 4 units to get 1 more unit of say X. So 1 unit of X for 8 units of Y, and when he moves to B, it is, how much does he sacrifice? 4Y to 1. Okay, and then so on. Again, I've just shown you. Now let's just take this. Now suppose when the consumer moves from B to C, what happens? The marginal rate of substitution in mathematical terms should be -2. When we compare -4 with -2, we may conclude that MRS has risen. But if we take only absolute values of MRS has fallen. So the value is meaningful because the rate of sacrifice actually falls. Note that it is the absolute value of MRS that declines continuously. So let us just, this makes the indifference curve downward sloping and convex to the origin. It is not only downward sloping, but it is convex to the origin. Okay, now look at this. Once again. So what do we see? First of all, let me just again tell you what is indifference curve. It is the locus of different combinations of the two goods the consumer consumes, with each of the combination having the same utility. So it slopes downward from left to right. That is, it's negatively sloped. It is because when the consumer increases consumption of X, he must reduce consumption of Y to keep his utility level unchanged. Also note that the indifference curve continuously approaches the two axes but never touches them. It is because the consumer consumes some quantity of each good. So it is because the consumer consumes some quantity of each good. If it touches any of the axes, it creates a possibility that the consumer consumes only one good, and that is what we are not, that is not the assumption that we've made. And so we see that this indifference curve is convex towards its origin, it's because the MRS continuously declines as the consumer moves downwards along the indifference curve. So now the slope of the indifference curve, what is it? It is the MRS. It is the marginal rate of substitution. So that's what it is. Now let's just let's just take slope B to C. What happens when it goes from slope? What is the slope of indifference curve when it moves from B to C? It is, we have BY as shown as change in Y, and FC shows change in X. So that is 2 by 1, 2 divided by 1. So that is 2. So look at the slope there. Now slope, when it goes from C to D, look at the slope of indifference curve. So what is that? CG upon GD. Okay. So then what happens? That is change in Y upon change in X. 1 upon 1 is 1. So remember that we take only the absolute values of the slope, and we find that the slope is continuously declining as we move downwards along the curve, and this gives the convex shape to the indifference curve. So you can get a question on define MRS, or how will you calculate MRS, and you can get a question as how explain what is the slope of the indifference curve. So these are a few questions.